Welcome to the National Press Foundation. We're coming to you from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios via Zoom. I'm Chris Adams, Director of Training for NPF. Today, we're continuing our series on understanding global trade. It's the fourth of 10 that will explore how trade alliances and supply chains are shifting, how trade enforcers are trying to maintain fairness, and how workers and consumers are affected by it all. We're thankful for our sponsor, the Heinrich Foundation, an Asia-based philanthropic organization that works to advance sustainable global trade. An update on our journalism awards. The winners of a recent round of awards for coverage of poverty and inequality were MedPage Today, the Mountain State Spotlight in West Virginia, and the California Divide Collaboration. We'll have another round of these awards later this spring, so watch for details at nationalpress.org. On our website, you can also see the winners of our Heinrich Foundation Award for Distinguished Reporting on Trade. A team from the Washington Post won for stories that brought to light the complexities of doing business in China, something we'll be talking about today. We're thrilled to have with us three experts to talk about drones, tech trade, and techno nationalism. Our guests are Alex Capri, a research fellow at the Heinrich Foundation and a visiting senior fellow at the National University of Singapore Business School. His white paper last summer, Strategic U.S.-China Decoupling in the Tech Sector, covered much of the ground we'll be talking about today. We also have Anupam Chander, a professor of law at Georgetown Law in Washington and an expert on the global regulation of new technologies. And we have Henry Gao, an associate professor of law in the School of Law in Singapore Management University. He's also a contributor for the Heinrich Foundation. And I want to thank both Henry and Alex, who are coming to us from Singapore. So it's late in the evening for them right now. So Alex, I want to thank you for coming to us from Singapore. And let me turn it over to you right now and give us the overview of drones and tech and techno nationalism and what all this means right now.
Thank you very much, Chris, and Henry and Anupam. Good to be with you as well. Looking forward to the panel discussion. I'm going to go ahead and share screen here and pull up the slides if I can. Everybody should see the slide. Very good.
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to try to present as succinct an overview of the trade and the geopolitical environment now as it pertains not just to drones, but to strategic technologies in general. And then I'll sort of bring it back to drones and specifically take a quick dive into DJI, the drone maker. So I'll start out again with an overview. We'll then take a look at the commercial drone market around the world. It's big, it's evolving, it's scaling up, it's embedding itself. Drones are embedding themselves in the overall digital ecosystem on the planet. They're incredibly important. And then, as I said, we'll talk about DJI, and then I'll just very briefly just talk a little bit about non-tariff barriers as they apply through the techno-nationalist lens to DJI. Okay, so let me start out with what I've been doing with the foundation, with the Heinrich Foundation. I have a book coming out very shortly on techno-nationalism. What is techno-nationalism? What does it mean, and what has it done, and what is it doing to the international trade landscape? Well, it's having a pervasive effect. Techno-nationalism is sort of a kind of neo-mercantilist approach to the world, where nation states begin to link the technology levels of advancement, the prowess and capabilities of national actors, local markets, with things like national security, increasingly with economic competitiveness. And I think the one that is really turning out to be the most vexing for the business community and actually for the public sector as well, governments around the world, is this linkage between technology standards and values and how that technology is actually applied to either promote or suppress specific values, right? And for that, we're seeing an overall, what I would call a paradigm shift in the trade environment, where we're moving away from, at least superficially, we're moving away from 70 years of so-called free trade, laissez-faire economics, the Washington consensus, if you will, and we're at a point where we have a Democratic Biden administration that clearly has said, we are not going to, we're going to put national interest ahead of any kind of overarching ideological framework of values around free trade. They're going to try and promote values around free trade, but where reciprocity is due, and I'm talking about reciprocity with Chinese techno nationalism and Chinese neo-mercantilism, we're seeing reciprocity. So that's a fundamental change in, certainly my career, going back now 30 years, starting as a customs officer in the US, spending 20 plus years in Asia, a lot of that in China, working with the world's multinational companies, building value chains. We are in a paradigm shift. This is a completely different way of looking at things from a policy perspective. So what does techno-nationalism do on value chains, on trade itself? Well, what it means is that we're going to see fragmentation. We're going to see acceleration of fragmentation of value chains, an increase in localization. We're going to see an increase in ring-fenced strategic industries, i.e. reshoring of strategic industries, bringing them back to key markets or to the home market, if you will. And the diversification that was already taking place before the so-called trade war, with the Trump administration, that's simply accelerated. So China plus one, China plus two, China plus three, diversifying your manufacturing, your supply chain, and then reverting now to much more of an in China for China strategy, and in Europe for Europe strategy, and there are other forces that are going to accelerate that. There's climate change. There's reduction of carbon footprints. There's automation now that allows for companies to reshore, and we're going to see more reshoring through automation that wouldn't have happened 10 or 15 years ago. So all of this is now converging. The geopolitics has now converged. COVID has accelerated this strategic decoupling. Where does this strategic decoupling happen? Remember, we're not talking about a zero-sum game here where the US and China, or China and Europe, are decoupling entirely. We may even see instances where we get increased investment flows to facilitate in China for China operations, or to facilitate localized ring-fenced operations in different parts of the world. But what we absolutely are seeing is strategic decoupling from China. The Chinese are absolutely doubling down on de-Americanizing their technology supply chains. We saw what happened to Huawei. We're now seeing what's happened to everybody from DJI to Dahua, SenseTime, Hikvision, all of these big Chinese tech companies, and potentially Alibaba when it comes to technology for the cloud, for cloud infrastructure, and so forth. So it's not a wise thing to be dependent or overly reliant on any one source of technology, and a foreign source, particularly if you're in a systemic rivalry with the country from where those technologies come. So that works both ways. The Chinese are decoupling. They're trying to decouple desperately from semiconductor technology. That's a topic for another night. The US is trying to cut its over-reliance on its offshoring of strategic industries. So we're seeing the semiconductor industry coming back. We're seeing rare earths, batteries, biopharma, pharma. These are all highly strategic industries that are going to decouple or diversify at the very least. localized ring fence, et cetera. Now, it's some areas that don't get as much attention, but will figure prominently into the strategic decoupling debate and discussion and strategy is when we start talking about data. So decoupling around the internet, decoupling of digital platforms, decoupling or what we call data sovereignty issues, where countries are looking to ring fence their internet, but also deny other parties from setting up shop, if you will. And we've seen that in India. They've just permanently banned recently 250 Chinese apps, including WeChat and others. The other areas are the innovation value chain. So we're in the beginning stages of the next chapter in academic, sort of what I would call academic KYC, know your customer, where we're going to see we're going to see some academic institutions that are going to be put on restricted entity lists, and we're already seeing that. We've seen the Harbin Institute of Technology placed on a restricted entity list recently. That had a significant effect with a lot of American universities. If Tsinghua University ever gets put on a restricted entity list, because Tsinghua University is the nerve center of a lot of state-sponsored innovation in China, particularly when it comes to semiconductors, there's going to be a significant ripple effect there, just from that. So the internet, the other is, excuse me, I won't get into it now, but I personally think that financial systems will decouple significantly once China brings its digital currency online, reduces its dependence on the US dollar. That will have implications for a big ecosystem in the financial services sector. And I think a lot of banks really don't know what's coming. I think they're really not ready for this. Okay, so again, who's caught in the middle? DJI is caught in the middle. Multinational companies are caught in the middle. They are being whipsawed, right? Because on one end, they're seen as strategic assets because they provide services and capabilities to governments, right? Whether that's Tencent building the blockchain for the Chinese government, whether that's Alibaba building the credit system, the social credit system, whatever it happens to be. It works the other way as well. I mean, you've got big American and Western companies that are contracted by the government that are instrumental in furthering policy. The big semiconductor companies in the US, for example, and so on. So multinationals are stuck in the middle. They're either, they've got pressure from their home governments, but they're also being targeted by other governments as being seen as de facto proxies, if you will. Chinese companies, in particular, Chinese tech companies, are in an absolute world of hurt right now because they are seen as tech proxies to the Chinese Communist Party. There's virtually nothing they can do to, there are very few things that they can do to convince other governments, at least certain governments, that they're not beholden to the party. So that's a problem. That's a challenge. And then finally, I mentioned there is now increasingly a linkage of export controls, restricted entities, sanctions aimed at companies that use technology for a particular end. And this is where DJI comes in. We'll come back to that in a bit. DJI and many other companies have now been targeted as facilitating human rights violations, using technology to further government actions that would result in some kind of human rights violation. So that's sort of a really, really fast tour of the environment. I won't go through all these slides, but here's the thing. The commercial drone market is massive. It's big. Drones are becoming ubiquitous. COVID-19 accelerated the use of drones for all kinds of purposes. Asia by 2024 will be by far the largest market. A lot of that will be China. That's significant for other reasons, which I'll come back to. But North America, Europe, and Australia, those are really, really, if you combine those, that's the biggest market, actually. And that's significant because of these value differences when it comes to consumption in markets where we could see restrictions against imports of Chinese. Same story with venture capital. There's a lot of venture capital pouring into the commercial drone industry, and I should specify commercial drones, meaning, and you'll see what I mean by commercial drones, right? We're not talking about military drones. We're talking about commercial application drones for the average consumer. If you see where businesses are investing in terms of innovative technology, drones are up there, right? 20% investments. You know, you've got companies looking at AI, you got companies looking at the cloud, the Internet of Things, you know, blockchain, all these things, data science. Drones are right up there. Drones are becoming indispensable in many ways. If we look at, again, what commercial drones are being used for, we've got the service providers themselves, and then we have internal services with businesses. There's all kinds of surveying going on, all kinds of mapping, etc. When we talk about the IoT and drone endpoint shipments, basically, if you look at, again, where we're seeing a lot of this stuff, there's big construction and infrastructure projects, you know, things, there's law enforcement, insurance is an interesting one. So again, it's quite widespread. Now, this slide is very important because we have a Chinese company dominating the world market, but we have liberal democracies, we have customers in open liberal dem countries buying this product. And by the way, as a lifelong photographer, I went to film school. DJI makes absolutely brilliant products. I absolutely love DJI. Their products are, the pictures are stable, sharp. The technology is affordable. I mean, it does some really cool stuff, right? You know, and you can see why it's been a big hit. But again, the divide over data privacy and data security is coming back to haunt trade on both sides when we look at Chinese-made commercial drones. China's growth is going to continue as well. That's significant because from a manufacturing perspective, as China continues to just expand its scale, it really gives the Chinese industry huge advantages in terms of R&D, in terms of manufacturing capabilities, particularly as the government is pouring more and more tech subsidies into, you know, as part of its very, very lofty technology goals and innovation goals. So again, I won't go through all of this in the interest of time, but it's being used everywhere. Now, DJI started through a partnership with two American companies, 3D Robotics and GoPro. They actually designed the first commercial drones, but they just couldn't, and this is where techno nationalism is coming back into the story. They partnered with DJI, but the supply chains were way too long. They had third parties all over the place that they couldn't bring together, that they couldn't coordinate properly with. They didn't have, you know, it was a much too fragmented value chain. The effort was completely plagued with issues. And you could say that that's a scenario that is very common now to innovation that takes place in Silicon Valley, where trying to get it from the drawing board or the design to the production, you essentially have to go to China to get that done. So that's what happened with DJI. DJI then was able to scale. They built critical mass with human capital. They were in the right kind of technology clusters. There was a lot of government initiatives that were providing all kinds of subsidies and all kinds of incentives to really encourage and bring together this evolution of this company, which it did. And the rest is history. They grew very quickly. They innovated at massive scale. I mean, think about it. 1,500 engineers all working on everything from ideation to production. They can literally walk across campus from the ideation room to the production room, pick up a sample and go, hey, this isn't right. That's not right. Walk back to the ideation room, work on it, right? And then put it out at scale. So they were continually putting out at scale new products and so on and so on. The value chain was very compressed and condensed. They didn't have the problems that GoPro did, for example. Once they had that, once they captured market share, they were able to get really good partnerships with my favorite camera brand, Hasselblad, the Swedish camera maker. One of the reasons why the images are so nice with DJI. Okay, so what then makes DJI, in a techno-nationalist sense and in a purely economic sense, when it's got 70+%, 80+% of the world market, and it is rolling out state-of-the-art technology when it comes to data capture, data transfer, and it is as ubiquitous as it is in those countries that I just showed you. That is a lot of potentially very sensitive data that can be hoovered up or vacuumed up by the Chinese state because of its relationship with its big companies, and because of their obligations through the cybersecurity and national security laws. So DJI was put on an entity list, a restricted entity list, and I think Henry and Anupam are going to get into that a little bit more. But essentially what that means is if you're supplying technology to DJI, at the least you're going to need an export license, which will most likely not be granted, although that's another topic in and of itself too, how that's playing out. Or you're just going to be blocked altogether, and you will not be able to sell that technology to DJI. So there's collateral damage, of course, because there are local companies that now are losing market share, they're losing a customer. But then there's also the damage that gets done to the buyer. And so the primary reasons given for this were on those grounds, essentially national security. There was the economic argument as well, and we see the social argument. So the argument that DJI is facilitating human rights abuses in places like Xinjiang province, because the surveillance technology that's being used there, as is the facial recognition cameras from Hikvision and the AI systems from Dahua and SenseTime. All of those companies were also put on restricted entity lists. So the question now becomes, will other non-Chinese companies in other parts of the world that might be supplying technology or making drones, finished drones, that then could be sold to interests in China, will they also now be blocked? And will we see techno diplomacy taking place with the Biden administration pressuring some of these other governments to take similar action? Coming full circle now, on the reshoring front, on the reciprocity in terms of subsidies and public-private partnerships and so forth, we're now starting to see the US government, European governments beginning to put up a lot of money to bring investment and to bring manufacturing back into a ring-fenced environment. So we're seeing the rise of a new Skydio, which is an American company. It's getting private funding, it's getting government funding. All right, I'll close on that. If you're interested in reading more about techno-nationalism, trade, etc., You can download any of these other topics, other reports that I've written for the Heinrich Foundation. And I'll close on that.
And we will put up a link for Alex's resources and resources from Henry and Anupam also, as well as other resources on drones, specifically on the drone story, on the entity list, on how that process works, and that'll all be posted on our website, as well as resources from today's program and a video of today's program and slides and so forth. So if you want to ask a question, raise your Zoom hand or put it into the Q&A chat function. We'll get to some questions in a bit, but I want to start. Anupam, I was hoping you could give us a little bit more about the entity list. Alex talked about it, but I'm curious about a couple of things. What exactly is it, and is it just at the Department of Commerce, or are there equivalent lists elsewhere in the government? And is this a tool that the Trump administration has ramped up use on, and kind of where's Biden administration going to go with it?
Great questions. And so first, thanks, Alex, for a terrific presentation. That was really, and I look forward to your book. By the way, Alex, you'll be pleased to know that I got an email from the Heinrich Foundation with one of your latest reports on India just this morning. So, I'm surrounded by Alex in everything. So the question fundamentally that is at issue, of course, is who will build the future, and what will that future look like? And so Alex helped us understand the Techno Nationalism question, and I think that those are incredibly serious. And we see this outside the US-China dyad as well. Similar issues are arising between the United States and Europe, with Europe complaining about the laws and actions of American companies as well. And so these issues are cross-cutting. They're not just between two jurisdictions. And Europe itself seeking to supply and keep on having relations with China during much of this time, stepping into that void created by American sanctions. So Chris, you asked me specifically about the entity list. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So the entity list is a list of companies subject to specific license requirements for exports of specified technologies or materials. So it's essentially kind of go back and imagine, we want to make sure that someone else doesn't develop nuclear, the ability to develop nuclear bombs. We want to stop the exports of technologies that might help them develop those nuclear bombs. Okay, that's the history of this, stopping the development of WMDs, for example. Okay, besides nuclear, other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. This is a list that is ultimately created by the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is a part of the Commerce Department. So one of the complicated things about US sanctions and national security lists is that there are so many different lists. The entity list is one list that has a specific result. That is, we don't provide these technologies or materials to those companies except when they are duly licensed. As Alex said, those licenses, I don't know if I were DJI, I'd even bother applying, right? So I don't know if I'd hire the lawyers to make that application. This is unlikely, it seems to me, in this case. Now, the fact is that these have been, this is a list first published in 1997. It's largely been, utilized, for WMD purposes. And at the end of the Trump administration, they started to really ramp up the US-China tech trade war. And so, as Alex's description of the trade war describes, much of that really came to a head with a lot of actions by the United States in 2020. Of course, this goes back a long way. So I'm not saying that the US fired the first shot. Obviously, we know that China banned a number of US technologies, right? So we had obviously a ban on Facebook. We had Google leaving in 2010. And shortly thereafter that, a ban on Cisco. So they said Cisco routers are impermissible. Why? Because it was a suggestion, which seems to be the case, that Cisco routers were compromised by the US government. And so we were sending Cisco routers to China, which might have been sending the data back to the United States. The United States now is concerned about the same reverse data flows, right? We saw this in the context of TikTok and at the end of in this last 6 months of 2020, the Trump administration making those claims about TikTok, relying upon the same cybersecurity law that Alex mentioned. And I want to say that I have I'm a little less. I want there to be a little bit kind of more scrutiny about that cybersecurity law. In the United States, we have laws as well that allow, through legal process, orders to American companies to divulge data. Okay, that is, in some sense, ubiquitous. Okay, and so a law that requires the sharing of data with governments under a certain process doesn't necessarily mean then that the United States now knows everything that an American company knows when it's operating across the world. And I don't think we should make the same assumption about the Chinese law. Now, 100%, the operation of the Chinese law and the US law will be different. So I don't mean to, I'm not calling any kind of, saying that there's an equivalence between the laws, but there's a lot of laws that demand that companies are compelled to share data. This was the case, this issue in a Supreme Court case called ultimately was mooted, but it was a case involving Microsoft and data stored in Ireland on Microsoft servers. And the US government in a prosecution wanted the data stored in Ireland. And it said to Microsoft, hey, turn over that data. And Microsoft said, hey, we can't turn over that data. That would be in violation of Irish laws. And the US government said, no, you have to. And ultimately, Congress passed a law that allowed for that compulsion under certain very, I think, human rights oriented rules. Those conditions may be absent in the Chinese version of this law. So I'm not trying to, again, do the equivalence. But we should recognize that the fact that these laws exist doesn't mean that the data is immediately then hoovered up, as Alex suggested. In any case, the entity list, going back to Alex's question, is a critical way to prevent a foreign company from advancing its technologies or getting closer to harming US foreign policy and national security goals. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so on the entity list, the limited announcement when it was put on the DJI was put on the entity list in December, lumped DJI with 3 other companies and said that these 4 entities have, quote, enabled wide-scale human rights abuses within China through abusive collection analysis and high technology surveillance. And so, I mean, the press coverage of it at the time was that DJI was being singled out because of the use of its technology and surveillance of Muslims in Northwest China. But there's not a whole lot of information on that. And so I have kind of 2 questions for you quickly, and then I want to turn to Henry to get his take on how the Chinese have responded to this. But one, is it unusual for the human rights abuses to be the cause of a company being put on the entity list? And will there be more information, put into the public record at some point in which the US government actually, provides more information about this particular allegation or charge?
So it's a great question. let's focus immediately on the question of the explanations. So we got human rights concerns. It's being used in surveillance across China, and that it's aiding. It's also, they also said, exports from China aiding repression abroad. So those are the concerns that were cited. So human rights concerns basically were the the top question. And so high-tech surveillance by the Chinese government or by authoritarian governments across the world. And I think those are somewhat surprising from the Trump administration. Donald Trump was repeatedly himself saying that he wasn't concerned about these it was for the Trump administration at all, the human rights concerns in Xinjiang province or in Hong Kong. And we heard repeatedly from President Trump, warm words about President Xi on, early on, at least, trying to avoid those kinds of the normal practices of the United States, which was to complain about Chinese human rights practices. The fact is, of course, technologies can be utilized for all, a lot of the technologies we use can be turned towards surveillance technologies. And so the reality is that DJI drones may well have been used in China for repression within Xinjiang or elsewhere, right? And that is a reality. And I think it's important that we add human rights to our export considerations. The problem is that for any company producing these technologies and selling them to law enforcement agencies in authoritarian states, they're just not going to be able to avoid being held to be complicit in repression by those states. Now, mind you, when we sell, DJI also outfits American law enforcement agencies. All 50 states apparently have law enforcement agencies with DJI drones. And our agencies too have been accused of human rights abuses. So I'm not, again, offering this as an equivalence, but technologies will be used in ways that are problematic and abet human rights abuse. So the question is how what kind of controls we put on them. Is it okay to send it to a police department that has a history of abuse of African Americans, versus is it okay to sell to abusers? So I think DJI is going to be in as Alex said, is going to be in an impossible situation, because if it refuses to sell to the Chinese government, it can't really operate a company in China. And so I think it's going to be, as Alex said, a very difficult road for these companies.
Okay, and just for the record, DJI, in response to being placed on the entity list, said DJI has done nothing to justify being placed on the entity list. We have always focused on building products that save lives and benefit society. And it said, we are evaluating options to ensure our customers, partners, and suppliers are treated fairly. Henry, I was hoping you could jump in and give us a sense of what's happened since December. So in December, the US government, through the Commerce Department, put DJI on as entity list, along with a few dozen other companies. How has China responded to that?
Sure. Actually, I would start off with a little earlier than December. So this is China's version of the unreliable entity list, which China issued last September in response to the US actions of putting many Chinese companies on the unreliable list. So it basically targets firms that cut off or block the supply chain to Chinese firms and take other discriminatory measures against Chinese firms. So as mentioned earlier by Anupam and also by Alex in that very comprehensive introductory remarks, So they both mentioned the US version of the entity list and also a bit of the Chinese version. So as Anupam mentioned, he said the Chinese version is going to be very different from the US. And I couldn't agree more, because if you look at the US, as Anupam explained just now, it is mainly used to basically prevent foreign firms from getting US technology. But the Chinese version of unreliable list is basically used to prevent foreign firms from blocking Chinese firms from getting US technology. So it's more like, kind of a reactionary measure rather than kind of an offensive measure. So after this was issued last September, many foreign companies operating in China or trading with China became worried. So they started to complain to the Chinese government, and they were, I think what they were essentially saying was that we were just complying with, the U.S. sanctions, for example, the entity list and so on. We were doing nothing wrong. Exactly like Anupam mentioned earlier, what the Microsoft, argued in that case. So that is why China actually introduced its own blocking statute this January, a few days, actually 10 days before Biden took office. So if you look at this blocking statute, it's really interesting because it basically tried to prevent foreign funds from complying with the foreign sanctions. So previously, foreign funds come in and they tell MOFCOM in China that we are just complying with US sanctions, and they saw that they could use that as an excuse of not supplying the technology or the parts to Chinese firms. But now China has its own version of blocking statute, and according to this statute, you cannot comply with foreign sanctions if certain conditions are satisfied. But if you look at this blocking statute, actually a lot of things were left unclear. When it was first announced, it seems, if you just look at the wording of the statute, it seems to be targeting mainly third country firms from complying with US sanctions against China. So it doesn't really directly, for example, in the case of the US, target US firms from complying with US sanctions. It's mainly to target third country firms from complying, with US sanctions, for example, Singapore firm or other countries' firm. But on January 15th, MOFCOM issued clarifications on the statute on its website, and then everything really went more ambiguous rather than clarified. So according to the new clarifications, the statute is mostly limited to Chinese entities, including foreign invested enterprises registered in China. So it doesn't really work towards third country firms. Except that there is a limited expansion to non-Chinese entities. And the second paragraph of Article 9, basically, that paragraph says, if a third country firm comply with the foreign sanctions, then Chinese firm could bring a case in Chinese court and ask the court to order the firm not to comply with the foreign sanctions. But according to this MOFCOM clarification, most of the time, it is supposed to only work against the Chinese firms and foreign firms operating in China. So that is why I would advise firms, especially foreign firms that operate in China, to try to segregate their Chinese operation from the rest of the world. If you look at the MOFCOM clarification, it really muddles water because right after I tweeted about the MOFCOM clarification on Twitter, MOFCOM actually removed this clarification from its website. So now the clarification no longer exists. So we don't know whether the clarification still stands or whether the MOFCOM has actually retracted its earlier clarification and revert back to the original wording of the statute and simply blame the clarification, on some, on some temporary worker in MOFCOM. So my take from all this is that even the MOFCOM probably doesn't know what they are doing. Sometimes, you get that in China because things were introduced in a hurry way. So I think they were just introducing the blocking statute, like I said, in a hurry way, in order to deter the new Biden administration from doing something crazy like Trump before him. But we don't know whether this is going to be used. I mean, the unreliable entity list introduced last September, so it's 6 months old, but it has never been used against any company. And similarly, the blocking statute, which was introduced in January, but so far has not been used. So I think what China is basically doing is basically trying to watch and see, to see, what the new administration of the US will be doing, and then try to react accordingly. So these two laws are in place, but I'm not sure that if they will ever be used, and if they are used, whether they will be as aggressive as the US sanctions.
Okay, so I mean, how going forward? I mean, when the Commerce Department put DJI on its entity list, as well as other companies, they have limited information. They have limited information. For example, they didn't specifically mention the surveillance in Northwest China, the region up there. They just have a throwaway line about surveillance techniques. Anupam, will they eventually kind of have to do, if the Biden administration pursues this, will they eventually have to supply more information?
So only if the DJI decides to challenge this in court. Prior challenges have faltered because of lack of proper explanation. This, I'm not saying that this will falter on those grounds, but let me just give you a little background. So last year, as I mentioned, the Trump administration banned TikTok and WeChat. And WeChat users in California filed a lawsuit, and TikTok filed a lawsuit in DC. And TikTok influencers filed a lawsuit in Pennsylvania. So, and all three of those won. All three of the plaintiffs in those cases won. TikTok in its own case, the TikTok influencers, two guys who were popular on TikTok, saying, "Hey, look, I'm worried about making TikToks and making money and being popular on TikTok." And then WeChat users who said, "Hey, we can't use it." And in all those cases, national security was asserted by the U.S. government, and the federal judges reviewing the national security claims said that the national security didn't trump the other concerns at issue, including, in some cases, Administrative Procedure Act issues, but also the issues of free speech, and in particular with respect to these apps. This month, Xiaomi, the Chinese smartphone manufacturer, challenged its designation as a communist, a Chinese communist company, and won. And so this is during the course of the Biden administration now. And the court said in a district, sorry, I have my this is Dobby, our fourth, my coworker here. So the Chinese communist designation, the court said, was not actually based on sufficient evidence. And in that case, the US government tried to explain why it had designated the company as a Chinese communist company. And one of the bases was because the leader of Xiaomi had received an award from the Chinese government. And that was a farcical basis for concluding that it was a Chinese communist company. We give lots of awards to people that doesn't suggest that they were, tied at the hip to the government. And so I think that will be an issue. I want to point out one other thing about the entity list. The weird thing about this decoupling, and Alex kind of, teed this up in his remarks, is that this actually are export prohibitions, as Henry said, are causing China to redouble its own R&D. so it's actually leading to Chinese innovation very dramatically. And so what we're doing is China is going to become a huge powerhouse in semiconductors because they can't buy semiconductors from the United States. And so the whole supply chain from the United States is being reverse engineered and recreated in China. And so the entity list had this kind of perverse effect of spurring Chinese innovation. And so it's a complicated situation as to how exactly the dynamics of all this will play out.
Okay. So Alex, first of all, did you have a comment on that? And I have a couple of questions for you.
Yeah, so look, I think the decoupling process started even before the Trump administration. I would argue that you could go all the way back to even before China's, the Made in China 2025 plan, which was essentially a proclamation that Chinese industry was going to out-innovate and lead and outproduce the rest of the world as a matter of policy. That in and of itself is essentially a decoupling statement. Right. I mean, that is a statement of intent, that sets in course, that sets a matter of course, that we've seen. I think that works both ways, right? I think we're in, China is doubling down on trying, it's got its dual source supply chain, right? It's, source as much as possible for a domestic production, have sealed off domestic supply chains for strategic products and goods. At the same time, I do see this as a somewhat of a second moonshot sort of moment for the United States and its allies, because essentially the ante's been upped. So we will see, as we saw during Cold War 1.0 with the Soviet Union and the space race, and you could even argue, post-World War II, and even before World War II, the Techno Nationalist race that was underway for the atomic bomb, et cetera. We're in that kind of geopolitical environment. It's a hybrid. It's a bizarre hybrid Cold War because we've got trade going on one hand. On the other, we have an actual Cold War going on the other hand. And you've got these long established value chains that have taken 30 years to materialize. So as I said, it's not a zero-sum outcome. It's a tiered kind of value chain where some of it absolutely will decouple and that it will now accelerate, and then others, who cares about shampoo, right? Who cares about where you buy certain products from? I think on the semiconductors, just Anupam, I would just say the weaponization of semiconductor supply chains has absolutely, as you say, led to a doubling down, in China, Beijing looking to come up with a closed loop around semiconductors. That is a very interesting issue because it is so hard to do. It could take them 10 years, it could take them 30 years. It may not ever happen because they're chasing a moving target. We could see, depending on how quantum computing evolves, we could potentially see, as the silicon chip it hits the end of Moore's law, we could potentially see a quantum leap being made in quantum computing, which would be historic. But we're years away from that, absolutely years away from that.
Okay, so we're running close on time. I want to get to several questions. Excuse me, Henry, but did you have a comment?
Yes, just two quick comments. Actually, one on Anupam's point about China doubling up as effort of technological competition. Dajiang DJI was added to the list on December 18th. On the same day, the party held its Central Economic Work Conference, which basically kind of outlined, the economic priorities for 2021. And it listed 8 priorities, and 3 of them actually about the technological rivalry. The first is strengthen China's strategic science and technological power. And the second, to enhance the ability to make the value chain self-controlled. And the third one is to speed up the cultivation of seeds for crops. So all these are about the tech, competition. So I think the Chinese are really serious. And also quickly on Alex's point regarding whether the Chinese will succeed in making the chips, I agree, in terms of the hardware, the Chinese will not be succeeding. But I think, another way of looking at this, whether China really need to be the number one in terms of the chips. And probably they don't need to, because if you look at, the mobile phones today, all these functions are actually all exceeding what a normal consumer would need. So maybe they are not getting the latest technology. They are getting, one or two generations behind, but still that will be sufficient for consumer use. And also you already see that, in the software market, when all these phones in China cannot install Google Play Store, so they have to install the Chinese version of the Play Stores. And I think maybe, sometimes from now, if this continues, we will see phones especially developed for China will start to emerge, so they would have one type of phone with a special type of hardware in China, because the government would ask these phones to have certain functions, for its own purposes. And then a different set of phones would be developed for the rest of the world, maybe.
Okay, so let me, it's a few minutes before 10, as long as all three speakers can all three speakers stick around a few minutes past 10 so we can get some more questions in. I want to, so if you do have a question, get it up there and we'll get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. I'd just like to note that we have folks from all over the world here. We have several from China, UK, Singapore, India, lots from the US, obviously. Ethiopia, so it looks like we have most of the globe represented here on the call today. But this question is from Paul Dinsdale, a writer in London. Alex, I see that you answered that in the chat, but I'd like to get a sense, give the answer to the full audience also. What's the extent of drone use so far by the federal government in monitoring populations in city or urban areas for crime prevention, security, or other purposes? And do we need to have tighter use on their laws to limit their potential invasion of privacy, intrusive surveillance, and spying? And so this is a US specific question, but are law enforcement organizations in the US kind of doing the same thing that we're accusing China of doing? Alex, I can't hear you.
The most common phrase of 2020, you're on mute, 2021. Yeah. It's very contentious in the United States, and we've already seen situations where the San Francisco Police Department was blocked from using cameras, basically for surveillance cameras, or putting up surveillance cameras, stationary surveillance cameras in different parts of the city. So that's clearly an issue that is going to face a lot of litigation, I think, in the United States. But eventually, I think we'll see standards. I think where we begin to see really very complex political and geopolitical fallout is where, as Anupam mentioned, you have Chinese companies essentially selling facial recognition technology to 80, 90 plus countries around the world. Actually, it's even more. It's over 100 countries around the world are buying facial recognition technology and installing it. Many of those countries could be considered authoritarian regimes. And that in and of itself then begs the question about other third parties in these ecosystems that are certain first tier, second tier suppliers, when these big brand companies like a Hikvision, which is buying technology from a lot of foreign companies, gets blocked, gets put on a restricted entity list, how far does that spill over into these other ecosystems? The answer is it can be very pervasive.
Okay, so a question for, I guess, either Henry or Anupam, in dealing with the World Trade Organization. Does the dispute dealing with an entity list, is that the kind of thing that could end up at the WTO? And has the WTO ever stepped into that kind of controversy before. Henry?
Okay, I will take a go with that question. So the WTO has a provision called security exception. It's Article 21 of the GATT. Until very recently, it was rarely used, so we kind of don't know how it is going to be interpreted. Then 2 years ago, there was a case that was decided, that was the Russia transit case. Basically, Russia has some restrictions on goods transit into Ukraine, because of the conflict between the two countries. So Ukraine sued Russia in the WTO, and we finally had an opportunity to see how this provision is going to be interpreted. And if you look at the provision, it basically says nothing in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade of the WTO, shall be construed to prevent any contract party from taking any action which is considered necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. And then it lists three scenarios. The first two are not really relevant here because they relate to trafficking arms and also nuclear materials and so on. The third one is most interesting. It refers to the measures taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations. So the panel had a chance actually to interpret these two key issues. First of all, what is the essential security interest? Now, on what is the essential security interest, the panel said this is a narrower concept on just the security interest because it used the word essential before security interest. And it may generally be understood to refer to those interests relating to the quintessential functions of the state, namely the protection of its territory and its population from external threat and the maintenance of law and public order internally. So the bar seems to be very high, it's at a very high level. And it also said that a glaring example of this would be where members sought to release itself from the structure of a reciprocal and mutually advantageous arrangement that constitute the multilateral trading system simply by relabeling the interests that it had agreed to protect and promote within the system as essential security interests. So basically the panel was saying that you cannot just label everything as essential security interests. You cannot say because our soldiers need shoes, therefore shoemaking is of essential security interest. So you cannot abuse it. Now, the other key issue here is what is the so-called other emergency in international relations? Does it cover the situation of the US-China trade war? So the panel here said that, it should be a situation of armed conflict or of latent armed conflict or of a heightened tension or crisis of general instability engulfing or surrounding a state. So that seems to imply that, situation like the trade war wouldn't qualify. And to make it even clearer, the panel explicitly said political or economic differences between members are not sufficient of themselves to constitute an emergency in international relations for purposes of this subparagraph. So I think the panel actually was talking in a way about the US-China trade war right there, where they were basically telling the US and China, look, you call this trade war, but we do not regard this as a war because a trade war is not an actual war, so it probably wouldn't qualify. So if this case ever end up in the WTO, I don't think the US would have a strong justification that, because of national security, therefore we are taking these actions. But let's take a step back. Will China really be taking this case to the WTO to start with? Here, I think, Alex or Anupam might disagree, but my personal take is that China probably wouldn't, because China, especially for the past year also, has also been taking all these measures, sanctions against the foreign entities, foreign individuals. So China probably doesn't also want, it's a glass house to be thrown stone at too, so it's like they are mutually guilty. So if China really sues the US, this would actually provide, first of all, opportunity for the US to bring cases against China's own measures. And second, in actually adjudicating these cases, the US would bring up all these issues, about the Xinjiang issue, about human rights issue, which China probably don't want to, discuss openly at the WTO. So I guess we probably are not going to see such a case at the WTO soon, even though as a trade lawyer, purely as a matter of academic interest,
Yeah.
I would love to see such a case.
Okay. Well, so, I mean, Anupam, if you could, you mentioned before the string of defeats for the Trump administration, various US district courts. Are there other cases out there percolating? Are we going to see more of those? And do you have a sense of whether the Biden administration is going to defend these cases that were started in the Trump years?
So as far as I can tell, the Biden administration is taking a very cautious approach to undoing the Trump administration's often rash and insufficiently justified actions. So it might have come in and simply reversed the Trump administration all around, including on steel tariffs and lots of other bilateral things. But in fact, with respect to China in particular, it said, well, let's take things slow. And I think in some sense, the Biden administration is using this as negotiating leverage. It really is trying to say, how can we reset the terms of between the countries and use this as a negotiating lever. I think for one thing that I discovered in my own kind of experience the last year, working and writing on the TikTok WeChat question, was that I think reporters, in particular American reporters, were not as skeptical of the Trump administration's national security rationale as they should have been. And I think, so this is my personal kind of call to reporters to kind of be careful about the national security rationale. Henry described Russia's invocation of the national security rationale at the WTO, and the WTO is saying, "Hey, let's think about this, whether or not national security was in fact implicated." And that's actually what U.S. courts have done again and again. And so, national security is often the basis on which countries can act in ways, and governments can act in ways that are helpful to the government in charge. And so I think we should be we as the public, and as I am as academics, we as the fourth estate, and we as courts should carefully consider those national security justifications, because national security justifications have often been abused over time. History is replete with claims that we need to do this oppressive act because of national security. And so I want to make sure that we're conscious of this. And what we saw with TikTok and WeChat and Xiaomi was US federal judges, including a Trump administration, a Trump appointed federal judge, a Federal Society member, in fact, ruling that the national security justification did not support a ban on TikTok in that case. So I'll pass the baton, but I think the reporters need to be equally scrutinize these things, and I think there is going to be a lot more scrutiny. I don't know if that can be justified in the DJI case. Human rights are a different are a foreign policy concern, not necessarily a national security concern, and so it has different. The evaluation of the human rights abuses and the use of technology in those human rights abuses is going to be much more complicated, I think, ultimately.
Okay, this might be the final question, but Anupam, if I could keep you, I asked Alex about the the law enforcement use of drones. This is slightly off point, but yesterday in the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, it came out that there was a stationary camera on a light that hadn't been revealed. And I'm wondering, are the privacy considerations of drones, which are flying cameras, any different than the privacy considerations of stationary cameras? And is that something, is there connectivity and kind of regulating those two things?
So, in some sense that they have similar issues, but the fact that it's the stationary camera has been positioned and oriented with some prior, process. The mobile cameras on drones, obviously by their very nature, are driven around and can be used to surveil in perhaps more unexpected places. The stationary cameras are pointing outside buildings, pointing inside buildings, pointing to streets, et cetera. But ultimately, so what I like to point out is that drones are a part of every utopia we imagine, and they're also equally part of every dystopia we imagine. And so we have to build the rules, whether these drones are made from China or the United States. We have to build laws to regulate how that data, what collection is happening, who uses that data. And I think you're seeing at the local level, and Alex pointed to San Francisco, et cetera, jurisdictions are trying to understand how is the police department actually surveilling this city. So we need to find out what's happening. But obviously it has important uses. I mean, the Derek Chauvin, surveillance cameras might help convict someone who did this atrocity. And so, so I'm not against this surveillance. I think we just need to regulate its use and make it, subject to, human rights-based processes.
Okay, and final question, Alex, I was hoping you could tackle a question that you also you dealt with in chat somewhat quickly, though. Is decoupling the end game, or is it just a tool to arrive at some sort of compromise or agreement with China? I mean, it's a big question, but what's...
Yes, as I responded in my reply, I think it's neither. This is not an either or world that we're living in. This is a world where global value chains in some areas are absolutely going to be severed. They will be treated completely differently than, for example, the middle ground, which has a lot of dual use technologies. These are technologies that are commercial in nature, but could be applied to military use. That's virtually every foundational and emerging technology out there today. That is a really messy gray area. Particularly when you look at what we're seeing in China with the military civil fusion programs. I mentioned earlier, universities being part of these whole ecosystems. So it just depends. I mean, it's a very nebulous area. Tomorrow we could see an incident in the South China Sea, and suddenly a lot of entities get put on the list. But it's neither or. That's what makes this so messy. This makes this such a complicated situation right now.
All right. And with that messy situation, we need to draw this to a close. I want to thank Alex and Henry and Anupam for sticking around with us, particularly Henry and Alex for doing so late in the evening in Singapore. We will have full resources, including a transcript, interactive transcript, and a full video from this program to our website later today or tomorrow. And we are continuing our program on global trade. We will have our next program in 2 weeks and every 2 weeks thereafter through the middle of the summer. So all of you, I hope you can come back to that. And for the speakers, again, thank you very much. And until our next program, I'll see everybody else later online.